This is a Red FM Vancouver podcast. Make sure you hit subscribe for more great content. For further info, log on to redfm.ca.
ਹੁਣ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿਰਾਏਦਾਰ ਨੇ, ਜਦੋਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਾ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਵਿਕਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ, ਤਾਂ ਕਿਰਾਏਦਾਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਈਆਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਰਾਏ ਦੇਣੇ ਬੰਦ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੇ। ਔਰ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਜਦੋਂ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਕੋਲੇ ਹਾਲ ਹੋਈ, ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਵਾਜ਼ਾਂ ਉਠਾਈਆਂ ਕਿ ਨਾ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਆ, ਨਾ ਮੂਵ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ, ਹੁਣ ਕਰੀਏ ਤਾਂ ਕੀ ਕਰੀਏ। ਫਿਰ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਕਈ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੀਆਂ ਤਰਮੀਮਾਂ ਅਤੇ ਕਈ ਕਿਸਮ ਦੀਆਂ ਸਕੀਮਾਂ ਚੱਲੀਆਂ, ਸੋਚ ਵਿਚਾਰਾਂ ਹੋਈਆਂ। ਪ੍ਰੀਮੀਅਰ ਨੇ ਕੁਝ ਐਲਾਨ ਵੀ ਕੀਤੇ ਨੇ। ਇਹ ਨਵੇਂ ਐਲਾਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਅਸਰ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਡੇਵਿਡ ਹੈਟਨੈਕ CEO ਨੇ LandlordBC ਦੇ, ਉਹ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਨਗੇ। Mr. Hutniak, good morning.
Good morning.
So please tell us a little about this rent payment plan.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically applies to what's called the COVID period, which is mid-March through to the end of June. And as you are likely aware, there was an eviction moratorium during that period of time. And, basically, during that period of time, landlords were encouraged to try to accommodate renters with rent deferral agreements and other accommodation.
Now, the main thing is, who will administrate this plan? Landlords?
Yes, I mean, the repayment here is basically mandated repayment, and landlords will enter into agreements with their individual tenants who have outstanding balances during that COVID period, and they're going to be amortized effectively through those repayments will be amortized through the end of June of next year. And this is nothing unfamiliar to landlords. We've been using deferral agreements for many, many years. So this is all, this can all be done by the sector quite easily.
Are the landlords happy with this plan, or still they're asking that they should be able to kick out those tenants who are not paying the rents for evictions?
Nobody's happy with anything. I mean, we're in a huge crisis here. It is continuing. It's been challenging for renters and landlords. But I mean, I think under the circumstances, this is a reasonable compromise. And, the fact of the matter is that these outstanding balances exist, and there's going to be opportunities for landlords, to collect those. And what basically, if renters refuse to enter into those agreements or default during the period of those repayment agreements, that the landlord is going to be able to take action, which includes, ending the tenancies. So I think it's a reasonable compromise under the circumstances, and it's going to work for our sector.
Mm-hmm. So, since you are the chief executive officers of this organization, LandlordBC, what the landlords want? Rental supplement plan extended or anything else?
Well, I mean, we started talking to the province really in April because we could see how this was going to unfold in the world. What our request was that landlords be effectively made whole for these unpaid rents due to the eviction moratorium. And, I think renters are obviously supportive of that as well. I think the government has done a really, solid job throughout this crisis, navigating it. They did provide a rent supplement. They extended it through August. And at the end of the day, it's like anything with government. You have conversations. You try to, position your sector for the best possible outcome. And this is where we're at. This is the best possible outcome at this juncture, and I think it's going to work. It's, again, it's not perfect, but it does provide our sector the opportunity to recoup those unpaid rents.
Well, about those unpaid rents, I mean, if tenants vacate the property, won't landlords be shortchanged then?
I've said repeatedly now, it's not the perfect solution. It is, but it is a workable solution. There definitely are going to be some landlords who are going to have challenges in recouping these outstanding balances. The other thing to remember is that the vast majority of renters continue to pay their rent during the crisis. So this is not like 50% of renters did not pay their rent. The province has some statistics that said 15% didn't pay any rent, but our statistics actually show a much better outcome than that. It was somewhat dependent upon whether it was smaller landlords maybe had a slightly higher non-payment scenario. But, by and large, renters in British Columbia recognize that maintaining their housing is really important and that they had a, contractual obligation.
Well, with these recent developments, you sound very helpless, I think. Or landlords are feeling that way?
Say it again?
Like with this new recent developments about this eviction and moratorium and the new plan, that most of the landlords are not happy with it. Like you sound kind of frustrated.
Well, I'm not frustrated at all. I'm saying that we are where we're at. I mean, there's unpaid rent during the COVID period. We're now going to have an opportunity. We're back to a full restart here, and come September with the repayment plan starting, and we're going to be completely in a sort of a restart or normal scenario for our sector, and it's going to take entering into these agreements and some time to recoup that unpaid rent, and all of it may not be recouped. That's fact. But
that's what I have spoken to some landlords. They're quite upset about it, that they're going to run away with their rents due. They're never going to pay that rent, and they'll be at loss.
No sector is left unscathed by this crisis. I mean, we have been saying all along to our members and the broader rental housing sector, I mean, it would be naive to think that we're going to walk away unscathed. That's just not going to happen. And anybody who expected that really is just not really looking at the reality of the situation. Every industry is going to suffer some consequences. Every Canadian is suffering some consequences. So our sector is not, unique in that, we're devoid of any impacts here. We're obviously impacted, but I think under the circumstances, again, vis-a-vis this unpaid rent during the COVID period, the fact that we have a government-mandated repayment program or framework here, that renters are going to have to enter with consequences if they don't. I think it's a reasonable compromise under the circumstances. And so, as a landlord, you're in a business. There are business risks, and that's part of this. But I mean, I think we're all in this together, and we our sector needs to be appreciative of the fact that this is like we're not going to be left unscathed, and. But I think, by and large, we came through this in much better shape than we could have. Mm-hmm. And our focus is on the future. We're obviously concerned about double-digit unemployment, and international students aren't coming here anymore. Or immigration is shut down. I mean, so we're concerned about the sector moving forward. But in the context of COVID-19, with this repayment program, I think, we're going to be able to, largely address the challenges that presented and try and move forward as best as we can.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. And we'll speak to you again. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for your
time. Thank you.
And have a great week, man.
Okay, bye-bye. ਇਹ ਲੈਂਡਲॉर्ड BC ਦੇ CEO ਨੇ, ਔਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬੇਸਿਕਲੀ ਇਹੀ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਖਾਤੇ 'ਚ ਪਾਤਾ COVID-19 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਫੀਲਡ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਅਨਟੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਿਹਾ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪ੍ਰਭਾਵਿਤ ਨਾ ਹੋਏ ਹੋਣ। ਸੋ ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਲੈਂਡਲॉर्ड ਵੀ ਬਿਜ਼ਨਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਆਪਣਾ ਕਿਰਾਏ 'ਤੇ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਅਤੇ ਉਸ 'ਚੋਂ ਪੈਸੇ ਬਣਾਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਘਾਟਾ ਖਾ ਜਾਣਗੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਕਿਰਾਏਦਾਰ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਕਿ ਹੁਣ ਉਹ ਪੈਸੇ ਨਾ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਜਾਣ। ਜੋ ਮੂਵ ਆਊਟ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਕੋਈ ਰਿਕੋਰਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣਾ ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਪੈਸੇ ਗਏ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ। ਪਰ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਸਰਕਾਰੀ ਅੰਕੜਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਮੇਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਖਾਂਦਾ। ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਅੰਕੜੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਵੱਧ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੰਦੇ, ਸਾਡੇ 15% ਨੇ। ਸੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਹੈ। ਦੂਜੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਫॉर फेयर एंड बैलेंस ਔਰ ਰੌਬ ਪੈਟਰਸਨ ਲੀਗਲ ਐਡਵੋਕੇਟ ਨੇ ਟੈਨੈਂਟਸ ਦੇ, ਉਹ ਦੱਸਣਗੇ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਰਿਪਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਨ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੈਸੇ ਦੇਣੇ ਨੇ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਵਿਕਟ ਕਰਨ ਤੋਂ ਰੋਕਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ, ਮੋਰਾਟੋਰੀਅਮ ਪਾਸ ਲਾਇਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ। Mr. Patterson, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. So how are the tenants feeling about this rent repayment plan?
I think many tenants are very, very concerned about the plan the government's announced. I myself and my colleagues at the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center are very concerned, and other tenant organizations. We think this is going to lead to a lot of tenants losing their homes. It's going to lead to many landlords losing out on money they need to pay their mortgage. We think this is there's a potential for a serious disaster that could only be increased if there's a second wave of COVID in the fall and many renters find themselves without a home during another spike of this disease.
Mm-hmm. David Hutniak, CEO of LandlordBC, just said it's okay compromise. It's a good compromise. Do you think it's a good compromise?
I'm not really sure I see it as much of a compromise, to be honest. In this particular case, what the government's saying is that landlords, regardless of the particular landlord, are going to get all the money, or are entitled to all the money they were owed under their rental agreements. There's no other industry that's gone through this COVID-19 period that has seen or has expected to lose no money.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst part about it is that if you think about, the kinds of landlords that are going to be affected, big, larger corporate landlords, like the kind that, are the majority that LandlordBC represents, are the ones that already have, their own lawyers. So if a tenant moves out, a large investment company can hire a lawyer and can try and pursue that tenant for the money they owe, if they aren't able to pay under the repayment plan.
Do you think that the government is trying to find ways to stop the rental supplement?
I think it's their intention to no longer continue it past August, and the rental supplement was an important support for landlords during this time for those tenants who couldn't pay rent. But the problem is that many small landlords aren't going to have the means to be able to try and go after these tenants if they owe any money. If a tenant moves out because they can't pay the rent and they owe all this money to the landlord from the spring when they didn't have a job, a landlord has to try and find a lawyer, has to try and find the tenant, has to pay the lawyer, and maybe at the end of the day the tenant doesn't have any money, because that was the real problem. The problem wasn't that tenants weren't paying their rent. The real problem was that tenants lost their jobs en masse. Unemployment overly affected tenants as a group of British Columbians. And the Premier just said last week, or rather 2 weeks ago, that we've seen 40% of the jobs that we lost come back. But what about the other 60%? On September 1st, every tenant's going to have to pay full rent, and there's going to be no rental housing supplement, and we'll have to see whether there's any, if CERB gets extended. Many tenants have only been able to make their payments because of CERB. So when that runs out and then tenants have to pay their full rent, how many are going to be vulnerable for eviction on September 1st?
Mm-hmm. Then, what should be done if the tenant is unable to pay the rent, in your opinion?
Well, I think that landlords should number one, not want the tenant to be responsible, because those tenants generally don't have the money to pay. So it's great to say I can sue my tenant because he didn't pay me my rent. But if that tenant doesn't have any money because they've gone through this COVID-19 period and they're still unemployed, you can't get blood from a stone. What we were calling for, what we were asking on government to do was, number one, forgive rent arrears for tenants. Make sure that tenants aren't going to be on the hook for restarting the landlord economy. But number two, direct financial support directly to landlords. Have landlords be able to go to the government and say, my tenant didn't pay rent. I'm going to lose my home because I rent my basement suite so I can pay my mortgage. I need this money to pay my mortgage, and have government direct financial support to them in that way. And that way you also make sure, unlike with the rental housing supplement, you're sending money to landlords who actually need that money, and you're not just sending it along to large investment companies who happen to own lots of land in the province. That obviously is not the direction the government's chosen to go, and we're very worried that the direction they have chosen to go is going to lead to, number one, a lot of tenants losing their homes, and number two, a lot of landlords potentially losing their homes, because they're not going to see this rental income anytime soon.
Do you agree that there are some tenants who are not paying the rent because of the moratorium on evictions?
There were certainly tenants who, because of the moratorium, were able to continue living in their homes without paying rent. We've heard a lot of landlords talk about tenants who they think haven't seen a reduction in their income, but still chose not to pay their rent. From what the province has said, it's about only 3 or 5% of tenants who paid zero rent during this period. But if you look at the numbers in terms of the number of tenants who lost their jobs and may have lost their entire income, and there's some tenants who wouldn't have qualified for CERB, then it's very possible indeed that those tenants had no income. There may be outlying tenants, a few tenants who had some money and didn't pay it. But it's on the whole, almost all tenants paid the rent that they could, because the government was telling them all the time, you're going to have to pay this back eventually, which is why, and now that has come to pass. Tenants responsible for all, or it looks like tenants will be responsible for all the rent that was missed. But expecting tenants to pay that back, it's number one, it's not reasonable to think that they can do that, given that we're still waiting for the economic recovery to sort of hit tenants. But number two, it's going to lead to a lot of those tenants losing their homes potentially in September or in October, when even if they enter into a repayment plan, their rent's going to go up potentially very significantly as those repayment plans start in October. Yeah, it's
in closing, can you briefly tell all the tenants like what is the crux of the matter is, what is the pith and substance of this government plan, this recent plan? Can they still be evicted or not?
So currently, up until September 1st, things remain as they are, and you cannot be evicted for non-payment. Other kinds of evictions are permitted again, but evictions for non-payment for rent that arrears that were due during the emergency period, so starting March 18th up until the end of August, that rent, you cannot be evicted for not paying during that time. On September 1st, tenants have to pay their full rent, and landlords are going to, the province is saying landlords have to try and enter into repayment plans with their tenants in order to be able to evict them. They can only try and evict them in September if they fail to enter into repayment plans.
The repayment plan can be like $10 a month.
Well, it could be $10 a month. It'll really depend on what landlords and tenants can do. I very much hope that many landlords are going to be reasonable out there and understand that many of their tenants will still find it very hard to pay rent. I would hope too that many landlords would realize that if they do choose to evict a tenant, now is not a particularly easy time to find a new tenant, especially in sort of smaller communities, simply because there aren't that many. Many tenants remain out of work. The economy has yet to rebound in many parts of the province. So hopefully, in many cases, it will be best for things to go on as they are, for tenants and landlords to enter into repayment plans that a tenant can still pay. But there will be situations, I would imagine, where landlords and tenants will not be able to agree. Or even if they can agree, that a tenant will not be able to afford that additional rent that they're going to have to pay. Because indeed, it could be $10 if they only missed a couple $100s back in the spring. But if a tenant missed 2 entire months full of rent, and then you have to that gets added on to the rent they have to pay between August of this year and July of next year.
Yeah, but there's no clear guidelines that if the tenant has missed maybe $800 worth of rent, then the payment must be 20% of that or whatever. If they say, well, that's all I can pay, I'll pay you $10 a month, and that's up to you.
Well, it's not clear what actually will happen if a landlord and tenant just can't agree.
Exactly.
A landlord has to...
It's very ambiguous, in my opinion, that even if the amount of the rent is $1,000, and then the tenant says, okay, I am willing to enter into a payment plan, so I will be paying $20 a month.
Right. I mean, that certainly...
Technically, that he's entered the payment plan, nobody can touch him.
Well, I think a landlord has to agree to it first, and I think also, so a landlord probably...
Well, if he doesn't agree till September 1st, he can't do anything anyway.
Well, certainly during the summer period, a landlord can't do anything. But come September 1st, there is that risk of eviction, obviously. But I think it's important to remember that, if tenants in the large part haven't been paying because they haven't been able to pay. Let's say a tenant owes their landlord $1,000 from missed rent during the spring. In the fall, so there's no protection. The details are unclear, but from what the government has said, it doesn't seem that a landlord has to offer any discount.
Okay. Mr. Patterson, we're running out of time. I'm up against the clock, so we will be speaking to you again. I think that doesn't seem to be the end of it. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Rob Patterson, ਲੀਗਲ ਐਡਵੋਕੇਟ ਨੇ ਕਿਰਾਏਦਾਰਾਂ ਦੇ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸੁਣੀ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਇਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਹ ਪਲਾਨ ਬਣਾਈ ਗਈ ਹੈ, ਇਹਦੇ 'ਚ 1 ਸਤੰਬਰ ਤੱਕ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ। ਜੇ ਕਿਰਾਏਦਾਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਵੀ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਦਿੰਦਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੱਢਿਆ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ। 1 ਸਤੰਬਰ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ BC ਦੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਫਿਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਤੇ ਕੋਈ ਐਕਸ਼ਨ ਲਿਆ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਜੇ ਉਹ ਕਿਸੇ ਪੇਮੈਂਟ ਪਲਾਨ 'ਚ ਐਂਟਰ ਕਰ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਲੈਟਸ ਸੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਕਿਰਾਇਆ $5,000 ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਔਰ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਠੀਕ ਆ ਮੈਂ ਹੁਣ ਕਿਸ਼ਤਾਂ 'ਚ ਦੇ ਦੂੰਗਾ ਤੈਨੂੰ। ਕਿਸ਼ਤ ਮੈਂ $10 ਮਹੀਨਾ ਦਿਆ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ। ਕੋਈ ਗਾਈਡਲਾਈਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਰੋਕ ਸਕੇ। ਹਾਂ, ਜੇ ਲੈਂਡਲੋਰਡ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਨੋ ਮੈਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਮੰਨਦਾ, $10 ਬਹੁਤ ਘੱਟ ਨੇ, ਤੂੰ $20 ਦੇ, ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਮੈਂ 15 ਦੇ ਦਿਆ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ, ਤਾਂ ਵੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕੱਢਿਆ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ 1 ਸਤੰਬਰ ਤੱਕ। 1 ਸਤੰਬਰ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਦੋਂ ਦੇਖਾਂਗੇ ਕੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ। ਸਜ਼ਾਵਾਂ ਇੰਨੀਆਂ ਸਖਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀਆਂ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਚੱਕ ਕੇ ਸਮਾਨ ਨੂੰ ਬਾਹਰ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਜਾਏ, ਔਰ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ 1 ਸਤੰਬਰ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਜੇ ਕਰੋਨਾ ਵਾਇਰਸ ਦੀ ਹੋਈ ਗੱਲ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਇਹਦੀ ਮਹਾਮਾਰੀ ਖਤਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋ ਜਾਣੀ। ਔਰ ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਦੂਜੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਕਹਿ ਰਿਹਾ ਅਕਤੂਬਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੈਕੰਡ ਫੇਜ਼ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿਰਾਏਦਾਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਨੌਕਰੀ ਖਤਮ ਹੋ ਜਾਣਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ CRB ਮਿਲਣਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਚੋਂ ਮੈਜੋਰਿਟੀ ਚੰਗੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਉਹ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਦੇ ਹੀ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਐਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੇ ਰਿਹਾ ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਭੱਤਾ ਵੀ ਲਈ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ, ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੰਦੇ, ਨਿਕਲਦੇ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਨਹੀਂ ਗੇ, ਉਹ ਐਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਹੀ ਰਿਹਾ। ਭਾਵੇਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਟੈਨੈਂਸੀ ਐਕਟ ਵਾਲੀ ਡੀਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਸਨ, ਉਹ ਹੁਣ ਵੀ ਰਹੇਗਾ, ਲੇਕਿਨ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਡੀਲ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਇਸ ਪਲਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਵੀ ਪ੍ਰਤੀਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ। ਨਾ ਹੀ ਕੋਈ ਗਾਈਡਲਾਈਨਸ ਰੱਖੀਆਂ ਗਈਆਂ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਇੰਨੇ % ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪੈਸੇ ਦੇਣੇ ਹੀ ਦੇਣੇ ਪੈਣੇ ਆ, ਕਿਸ਼ਤ ਇਦੋਂ ਘੱਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ। ਖੈਰ, ਆਪਾਂ ਕੁਝ ਹਫ਼ਤਿਆਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਫਿਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੋਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ, ਦੇਖਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਹੁਣ ਕੀ ਡਿਵੈਲਪਮੈਂਟਸ ਹੋ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਨੇ।
Thank you for listening to another Red FM podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and check out our Red FM Canada YouTube channel. For further info, log on to our Red FM social media platforms or visit redfm.ca.